So hopefully you are able to hear and see. Sorry for the problem. Apparently the account of the classroom has changed the password, and we cannot see the password, so the Semra Hoca needs to send it to us, but now we are going to use this meeting ID. But the things will not change, only there is, I think, a 40 minutes limit when you are using the personal account, so at some point the meeting could end automatically. In that case, I will restart it and you will be able to join it using the same meeting ID. Other than that, so we put the functional requirements document, and it contains all the remaining stages of the project, including the due dates and all the other stuff, so what you need to implement, etc. For each of the projects, we have 3 different scenarios. So the implementation stage 1 is upcoming. It will be on 27th of April. For this stage, you just create your Access database, you create your tables, relationships, and we expect you to put at least 10 meaningful entries to each of your tables. So it is going to be you are inventing some usernames, some relations in between, etc. And for this one, the feedback is going to be again on the Moodle. But if your TA thinks that it is going to be necessary, you might do a meeting on Zoom as well. So it is up to the TA. So it should be a simple task. For the implementation stage 2, so based on which project you have 3 different scenarios in each of them, and you are going to choose one of them for the implementation stage 2 and implement it using the forms. So we want the user interface to be functional. And for this stage, so the upload date is the same, but during the lab, so if you look into the schedule, we have the project lab on the 15th week. So during the lab, you are going to show it to your TA, and since we are going to use separate meetings, so the TA will send you the meeting ID. So we will put a schedule for each of the groups, and you are going to connect to the meeting and show the database using a screen share. And we expect all the group members to be in that meeting. After that, we have the final demo. So in the final demo, all 3 of the scenarios should be done. The demo would be similar to implementation stage 2. And the last day to do that is going to be 29th of May. But you cannot do the demo at this time. So for the demo, you should come up with a date and time with your TA. So you are going to show the final demo to the TA that is assigned to your project, and that TA will grade your project. So you should arrange a meeting time. Some people prefer to finish it early, and it is okay for us. So if you want, in the implementation stage 2, if you can complete all 3 scenarios and show it, then it's okay for us as well. But otherwise you will have time until this 29th of May, but preferably you should meet with us during the weekdays and during normal times. We also have the peer review, and if you are going to give 100 to everyone, then there is no need to upload a peer review. For all these stages, the upload page is online in Moodle. And if you have any questions, you can ask. Otherwise, we are going to start. So today it will be, I guess, shorter. We are going to just implement the login system using the graphical elements. And again, I'm recording it with a different software, therefore you are not seeing the Zoom recording sign, but it will be available afterwards. So we will continue using the Lab 5 finished database. So if you would like to follow using Access, you can download the database. And remember, since we downloaded it, we should first enable the content. And we started using UI elements. We were using some queries, and inside the queries we are able to reach the items that are included inside our forms. So to do that inside a query, you can start by saying forms exclamation mark and then the name of the form followed by the name of the item. Then you can get the value out of it. If it's a text box, for example, you can get whatever the user input there. We also see the usage of temporary variables. So you can at any part define a temporary variable, set it somewhere in your application and use it afterwards. So today we are going to implement a login system. And with the login system, what we basically need is that we just need the name and password of the user. So the name and password would be an input. And we are going to search whether such user exists or not. So inside the user table, we have the attributes username and password. And I'm going to first create a query, going to create a query design. Let's do it in the SQL view. So let's say given a username and password, I would like to get the ID of such user. So I would like to select the ID from the user table. And my condition would be, I want the username to be equal to something. Username equals to something. And my other condition is going to be for password to be equal to something. So password equals to something. And for these somethings, I can either use temporary variables or I can also get them from the form elements directly. So let's go with the first option, using the form items directly. To do that, I need the form. So I'm going to create a new form, a blank form. And remember, to get the items inside the form, I need to save this form. Let's call it the login form or login page something. So remember, I should be in the layout view to add new elements in it. I'm going to add two different text boxes and also a button. And remember, we are not using the wizard. I'm canceling the button wizard. So for this first text box, I'm going to rename it. Just right click on the text box, go into the properties view. We have different options for each of the elements, and for the text boxes or for the elements that we get input from the user, the important thing is to set its name to something we know. So otherwise they are automatically generated. In this case, let's say the user's username will come from here. Let's call it UN, for example, username. And for the second text box, I'm going to get the password. Let's call it PS for password. So the shorter things will work better for us. These are, I guess, case sensitive, and if they are not matching exactly, then you would get some error saying that we cannot find the value, etc. And sometimes those error messages may not be that meaningful, so it is better to check it first. So we want the username inside this text box, so I'm going to double click on the label to change the caption to username, and for the second one I'm going to say, okay, the user needs to enter the password in this box. So at any place, if I run my query, to get the value that's written inside this text box, I can say login form and then the item's name is UN. So in my query, following the format saying forms, so okay, within all the forms, there is a form called login form, and inside that form there is an item with the name UN. Get the value out of it, and the username of the users that I look for should have the equal username. So it is not a search option. So in the homework we had some searching keywords, so we might look for an letter A within any place. Then I need to use the keyword like, and in my string I can use the regular expression characters, so the question marks and star symbols, but I want the exact match now for the username and password. And for the password, it is going to come from the text box called PS. And I'm going to save this query, and let's rename it like find user. So this is going to find the user ID. Let's call it find user ID for the given information. Back to my login form. So whenever I call this, so maybe I can do it like that. So going back to the form view of this login form, if I were to run the find user ID query now, then it's going to return me nothing. So there is no existing user with these empty text boxes. But if I go to my user table, copy some name, 2L8 is the password. So if I were to write these, right now the query is not attached to the button, but now I would like to run the query directly in this design view. So going back to SQL view, I can run this query again. In the login form, maybe I need to check it again. 2L8 and Rick. I should be careful about the typing. I'm checking again whether they are correct or not. So these two should apply at the same time. Let me get rid of one of the conditions for now and try to run it again. Okay, the 9 is matching. So if I just enter the name, there is no problem. For the password, let's try it again, 2L8, and in my SQL view, this was what I just written. Password, the attribute name, forms, login form. Maybe I should also check the name of the item. So it's called PS, that's correct. If I try to run it again, okay. Maybe there was some problem before. Now it's working, okay. So I know that my query works, so I didn't need to check it, but just to like see it working. I'm going to close that query now, and I would like to run that query while I'm in this form view. So in the layout view, I'm going to first double click on the button to give a better name to it. Maybe we can say login. And to attach the functionality, I can right click on the button, going to the build events, and we were using the macro builder. We also have the option to use Visual Basic, but using macros are like easier. So inside this part, we did in the last lab, we are able to set temporary variables. If you remember, I can give a name to a temporary variable, and after setting it at any part, I can access the value saying temp vars, exclamation mark, and then the name of the variable. The name of the variable is something we decide. So we can decide, like in here, it is the user's ID. I can call it UID. It is going to, while the application is running, there is a temporary variables table. In that table, we are creating a new variable called UID, and I can just type directly the value, or I can get the value out of some function. And the function we have used was called dlookup. So dlookup function, for the second parameter, it gets the name of the query. You should use the quotation marks. In between there is semicolon. And for the first attribute, for the first parameter, it gets the attribute name. So you should know what query you would like to run, and you should also know which column you are interested in. It is going to get the value for the first result. So for some queries, you can get multiple results, but it is going to get this attribute for only the first result. So in this case, we are going to write the dlookup function like this. So I'm going to start saying dlookup, okay. The column that I would like to get is the ID column, but I should check for the correctness. So I'm going to just for now set it to some direct value. I'm going back to my find user ID query. So I see that the column name is ID. So these should match exactly, otherwise we will get error. So the attribute name is going to be ID, and I should also know the query name. In this case, it's find user ID. And this is again, I guess, case sensitive, so these should be matching exactly. So this is going to be my function to get the ID of the user if such user exists. So I close my query, I don't have any business with it anymore. In the layout view of my login form, I'm going into the build events of the button. And instead of setting it into some direct value, I'm going to call the dlookup function to run my query and get the first result. The problem is that there may be no such results. So I'm going to, for now, add an if action here. And I would like to check whether this UID is empty or not. So I'm getting the value, and whatever it is, I'm putting inside UID. But if this dlookup function doesn't return anything, if I cannot find a matching user with the password and username, it could be empty. So to check whether it is empty or not, we have the function called isEmpty. It's a simple function. It just gets the name of the element that you would like to check whether it is empty or not. It could be a UI element like a text box, or it could be a temporary variable. So I can write temp vars. If I start writing it, it is going to autocomplete it as well. And the temporary variable that I would like to access is UID. So I can write it like this. So UID is not existing yet. I didn't run this macro yet, but if it was existing item, it will also autocomplete it. So this is the thing that I just wrote there. Inside all my temporary variables, I'm checking whether UID is empty or not. If it's empty, then I'm going to show a message box. So remember, we had the message box. We can say no such user. For this if action, I can also add an else part. And in the else part, I can say, okay, found user, and I can also attach the user ID. Remember, to do that, we use such notation. For the message box, if you are to start with an equals symbol, then you can put expressions, you can put variables. So I'm going to write user ID equals to something. And that's something, I concatenate the strings using the ampersand sign, and I also attach from the temp vars exclamation mark. So I know that UID is not empty if I'm in this position, because we are at the else part of this isEmpty function. So then we can show the user ID on screen in a message box. So for now, I'm going to save it and close it, and I should make sure that the query that I run is not open, otherwise we might get a problem. If it's open as a tab, it's not going to run it, it's going to show it inside the datasheet view. So if you are running inside the forms, the queries should be closed. So this is the correct information. If I click on login, it's going to write the ID of that user. But if I enter some wrong information and click on login, now, since at the last position we inserted the user, so right now what happened is that we created the temporary variable for UID, but then we replaced it with an empty thing, I guess. So it's going into the correct position, but there is no ID. So to show it, if this was not open and if I were to open login form from scratch and if I try to login, okay, we are again showing it. I should check something going into the build event. So I'm using the isEmpty function. Maybe I should use the isNull function then. Okay, let's try the isNull function then, because if it is existent, if there is this variable, then I guess it assumes that it is not empty even if it has null value. So I should use the isNull function then. Sorry about that. Let's use the isNull function. So now if I were to try to log in, says no such user. Let's get JNN911. So this is an existing user with user ID 1, but if I were to enter the password incorrectly, then it is going to say no such user. So any problems, questions so far? We are just using the dlookup function to run the query, and that query is getting us the user ID for the given username and password. But if it cannot find such ID, we are using the isNull function with this temporary variable. Any problems, questions? So then let's try to make it in a better way. So what could happen? So if the user is leaving the username empty, then it's trying to log in, but the message is saying no such user. Maybe that's not the case. So we might enter some correct password, maybe, or let's say it like that. This message is not that good. So the problem here is that we don't have any username. It's not that there is no such user with null username. The user is expected to enter some username into this box. So going into the layout view, I am going into the macro of the button. Before trying to run this query, I should check whether the text boxes are empty or not. So I'm going to add a new action and I will carry it at top. So my first action, I'm going to add an if action, and I'm carrying it to be my first action. So you can like get these elements from their names and carry it around, or you can also use these green buttons to shift them up and down, but carrying them I guess easier. So the first thing I would like to check is using the isEmpty, or again I guess isNull would be better, whether it is null or not. Okay, I'm going to use the isNull function, and since I'm at the same page, so this macro is in the login form, I can directly refer to the elements of the login form. So remember, the text box was named UN. For the username, we had a text box called UN, and I can check whether it is empty or not. If it is empty, so if UN is null, then I can put a message box saying username cannot be empty, because the problem at this position is this: username is empty, therefore I show this message. Otherwise, for this if, I'm going to add an else part. If UN is not null, I still need to check whether the password is null or not. Then in that case, maybe adding an else if would be better. So I just removed the else. I'm going to add else if block. I can put some other condition in here. So I can write is null. I can run the isNull function, this time for PS, the password text box. If it is empty, then this time the message box would say password cannot be empty. Passing all these, for this else if, I'm going to add an else part. Now I know that UN and PS are not empty. So at this position, I'm going to run my dlookup function. So I'm carrying this setting temporary variable part into the else. So I have this if block and then else if, and at the end this else. In this part I can set the temporary variable and then check whether this user exists or not. So all the things that I have done, I'm putting them into this else part. And you need to be careful about this, because like carrying the items around, you might get some non-meaningful things. So right now I'm checking the UN and PS, and then if they are both not null, I'm setting the temporary variable, and then I have an if part for UI to be null. If there is no such user, I'm showing the message, but I also need to carry this message box as well. And for that I need the else part of this. So I'm going to put this: if the UID is not null, then I'm going to show the user ID. So this if action was the thing that we first created. I'm going to remove it now because right now we have it in some other position. And you can remember open and close these actions to see it better. So for the first if part, I'm checking whether UN is null. If it's null, I'm saying username cannot be empty. For the else if, I'm checking the PS. If it's empty, I'm showing my message. If it's null, let's say in a more correct way. On the else part, I'm setting this UID, and then I'm checking this UID. So if this UID is null, then there is no such user. But if it is not null, I was showing the user ID. So let's save it and close it, and let's test it now. So I'm going into the form view to test it. So now there is nothing written. If I try to log in, the first thing we checked was this first text box. So it is saying that the username cannot be empty. So if I were to write something and try to log in again, now it's saying that password cannot be empty because I left the password out. If I enter some random thing there, if I try to log in, now I see the no such user message. And if I try to log in with Jane and 911, then I should be able to see the user ID now. So first part is done. I know the ID of this user. But now I'm interested in whether this user is a teacher, a student, or a staff member. So let's say we have separate home pages for each different kind of user, and we would like to navigate accordingly. So I should know whether this is a teacher, a student, or a staff member. One simple solution could be to add some combo box here. Maybe the user could select which type of user that we would like to try to log in as. That's an option, but you can also do it automatically. So to do it automatically, I need some queries. So the find user ID query, if I look at here, was getting me the user ID given the username and password. And I need some queries to check a given ID inside the student table, teacher table, and also the staff member table. So going to create and then query design, I will go into the SQL view. So I will give the ID. So if we check the student table, for example, in the student table, if that user is a student, so in the user table we have the IDs of the users, and if that user, for example, user number 9 is a student, we have that ID inside the student table as well. So given a user ID, if I would like to check whether this user is a student or not, I should select the student table for student ID to be equal to something. So I'm writing that query now. So look at the student table. I will give you an ID. If there is such an student, then return me the ID, let's say. The column name is student ID for this one. So I'm going to return the student underscore ID. let's write the from part from the student table, and my condition is for student ID to be equal to something, and that something is going to be our user ID. So remember, in the macro we set the temporary variable, and that was called, within the temp vars we called it the UID, and we are able to check it saying temp vars UID. We can get the value of it saying temp vars exclamation mark followed by the name of the variable. So if I can find such student ID, then we can say that this user is a student. So let's call this is UID student for this query, and let's have different versions of it. So this checks whether the given UID is a student or not. If that's a student, then it will return the ID of that student. If the given UID is not a student, then it will return null. Then I can check whether it's null or not to decide whether this user is a student or not. So I'm going to copy this and do the variations. So going to create and query design, I'm going to close this dialog, going to the SQL view. I will paste it, but this time I would like to do it for the teacher, and in teacher table the column name is called teacher ID, so I will change it. So instead of saying student ID, it's going to be teacher ID. And again, I'm doing it for the given UID because this is the user ID that I find using the login query. So the find user ID query just found this ID. I know that it's an existing user. Now I'm checking whether this is a student, a teacher, or a staff member. So it should be from the teacher table as well. So I'm going to save it. I can say is UID teacher for this one. So we need the separate queries, and I'm going to create a final one, going through create and query design, closing this dialog, going into the SQL view. Now I would like to do the similar thing. So I also need this semicolon here. So the similar thing for staff table. In there we have the staff ID. So if I go back to here, I can say, okay, this time the staff ID, UID is coming from the same position, and we are looking at the staff table, and this is going to be called is UID staff. So these are kind of straightforward till here. So I'm going to save these queries and close them. And going back to my login form, going back to the layout view, I will go into the macro page of the button. At the position where I was showing the user's ID at here, I know that UID is not null because I already checked it. I know that UID is not null at the position that I display this message box in the else part of this block. Now I'm going to decide whether this is a student, staff, or teacher. To do that, I need other temporary variables. So I'm going to put a set temp var action, and for each of them I'm going to decide on names. So let's say UID was for user ID. I'm going to say SID, TID, and for staff ID, let's call it FID. So these are going to be my temporary variable names, and I'm going to fill them using the dlookup functions. So let's call it for the first one SID. Remember the usage of the dlookup function for the SID. I had a query, so the query name was called is UID students. Again, this should match exactly. I should double check it. I should be correct. And the column that we select, the column that we project was called the student underscore ID. this name should be correct as well, otherwise we will get an error. And maybe we can also show that error at some point. So let's set the temporary variable for SID for now. And then I can check whether this SID is null or not. So I'm going to put an if block here. And in here, I'm going to say is null. And it is going to be for temp vars exclamation mark SID. So I just try to set some SID, check whether it is null or not. If it's null, then I can say that this is not a student. But I can also add an else part for this. And in this else part, I can put a message box saying that this is a student. So if it is null, I can also, for now, put a message box saying that this is not student. So I'm going to save and close it to test it just for now. Going back to the form view, I know that the other things will still work. So if I leave the username empty, it's going to say that username cannot be empty, etc. But if I try to log in, it is going to first show the ID of that user, and then it is showing that this is not a student. And if I try to log in with a student, for example, let's try one of them. I see the user ID, and then I see the message saying that this is a student. And I would like to also show you what could be a problem if I have some typo in my dlookup function. So let's say instead of student, let's omit one letter and save it and close it. Now going back to my form view, if I try to run it, I see the first ID, then this is the message that I get. So for the set temp var action, we have the error code, but it's not specifying it in an understandable way. You just see the lookup function. This lookup function is not running. The problem is that because of the typo that I have for the query name. So be careful about it. So if you have an error inside your macros, these are the errors that you might get. So it's better to double check the query names, etc. So going back to here, I'm going to fix the problem, the query name. And now you can do it like in different orders. For now, let's try to like put some actions at this position. So I'm going to set temp var action. Let's put it next to SID. So I'm going to create all these 3 temporary variables using the corresponding dlookup functions. So for the teacher, it's going to be teacher underscore ID, and the query name was isUID teacher. For this one, it's going to be staff underscore ID, and its query name is going to be isUID staff. So I'm creating the temporary variables. So TID, get the value using the dlookup function. I'm going to create a new set temp var action, put it in the correct position. For the staff ID, we decided to use the name FID, and it's going to come from this dlookup function. In the middle, we have the semicolon. The names of the queries and attributes are in double quotation. And now I have this SID, TID, and FID. I can decide which kind of user this is. So at this part, I'm using isNull function for SID. If it is not null, on the else part, I decided that this is a student. Then if I were to navigate into the student page, for example, I can say open form, and then I can get into that form. But if this is not a student, instead of showing the message saying that this is not a student, we will continue. So I'm going to delete this message box. If SID is null, then I can still check with other if conditions. I can still check whether TID is null or not. So I'm going to write within the temporary variables, is TID null or not? If TID is also null, then I know that SID is null, TID is null. Without checking FID, if in my database a user is either a teacher or a staff member or a student, then I can decide that this is a staff member without checking FID. But to make it sure, you can still like continue checking FID. But at this position, I'm going to say message box, this is a staff member. If TID is not null, for this if block, I'm going to add an else part. In there, I can say this is a teacher since TID is not null. So if we were to like look it again, closing, hiding all the different blocks to see it clearly. At first, I'm checking the message boxes, UN, the first username message box, and the password message box. If they are empty, we cannot continue. We ask for user to enter something there. If they are not empty, then I'm trying to find some such user, setting the temporary variable UID. If that is null, if I cannot find such user, I display the message saying that no such user exists. But if UID is not null, then I can continue to decide on the type of this user. Let's also hide this ones to make it more clear. So I can, at this part, knowing that UID is not empty, not null, I can display the ID of the user, saying that this is an existing user. Okay, you find the matching password and username. But to decide the type of the user, I'm setting additional temporary variables. And I just wrote the queries for getting the ID of the student given the user ID. So given a user ID, if this is a student, the isUID student query will return the student ID, which is a matching ID, but if I can pass this query with some not null value, I know that this is going to be a student. Similarly, for teacher and staff members, we have such temporary variables. Then after we set all these, I'm checking whether these are null or not. I'm checking first for SID. If SID is null, I can say that this is not a student. But if it is not null, on the else part of this, I can decide that this is a student. But continuing from SID being null, then I can still check TID. Knowing that this is not a student, I check whether this is a teacher or not. If TID is null, this is not a student, this is not a teacher, then this is a staff member. At this position, if TID is not null, in the else parts, I can decide saying that this is a teacher. So let's also check it's running. I will close this, going into the form view with the students. If I try to log in, I see the user ID and then I see the message saying that this is a student. So let's look for a teacher. For example, number 1 is a teacher. In the user table, I look for the username and password. If I go back into here and enter for Jnan 911, then I should see the user ID and then the message saying that this is a teacher. So for a staff member as well, for example, number 5 is a staff member. I'm going to get the username and password. And if I try to log in with this information now, I would see that this is a staff member. Any questions, problems? So I will also like to complete it. Let's make a little page for each of the different kinds of users. I guess the meeting might stop in a minute. I guess I'm not sure about how long it lasted, but I'm going to end the meeting and restart it again. So you can like
Hocam,
efendim.
hocam, if your account is Bilkent, you get Bilkent or something, it won't.
It won't stop. Okay, then let's
Yeah,
continue again.
I just opened yesterday with my friends and it's not open. It's not closed in 40 minutes.
Okay, then let's continue because we don't like actually have that much left. If it's like closes, I'm going to reopen it again. Okay, so now I want separate pages for each different kinds of users. So I'm going to create the blank forms for them. So let's save it. Let's call it for this one student form. Another blank form. Let's save it. This is going to be the staff form. And another blank form. I'm going to again save it. Call it teacher form. And again in here, no empty spaces. It is allowing it, but if you put empty spaces there, it might give some errors if you try to access them in the queries, etc. So inside the student form, let's make another query to show the user information if we know the user ID. So I can find the user ID given the information for the username and password. And in the reverse way, if I know the ID, I can get the username and all different kinds of informations. And inside the student form, let's say I have a list box. Using list boxes are easier to get the information out of a query. And let's create a query to do so. So I'm going to create and then query design. I would like to, let's use the QB. I would like to get the information from the user table for the UID, for the given UID. Let's say I would like to show the username and password. And I also know that this is a student, so I can include the student table because I'm going to include this query inside the student form. If I'm in the student form, I should guarantee that this is going to be a student. And if I include these two tables, it's going to join them because of the relationship we defined earlier. Now let's say I would like to get the, so these are like using larger fonts to make it more visible in my computer, therefore like I'm going to like rescale them to see the text. In the user table, let's get the username and the surname. Like a Moodle page, when you log in, you see your name, surname, etc. Let's also show the scholarship amount from the student table. And my criteria is going to be for the user ID. So I don't want to display the user ID, but I will put a condition for the user ID, and it should be equal to from the temp vars. Remember we had UID. I know that UID should not be empty if I go into the student form because I should go through login form. And using this UID, I can find the matching student. So I'm going to save this query. Let's call it UID to student info something. So it is giving information about the student. And this is not going to work for other types of users because we are also getting the result from the student table. We are making the join operation. So I will close this, and inside the student form, in the layout view, under the design tab, I'm going to add a list box. Even you would like to just display one result, using list boxes is easier. You can also like going through different paths. You can set the content of label, etc. But we don't expect such thing. So use the easier option whenever you can. I'm going to add a list box here. I would like to get the results out of a query. So for the first option selected, and I'm going to find the query that I just saved. So it is called UID to student info. I'm going to click on next. So these are the things that it shows us. I'm going to include all of them. And I know that it is going to display just one result. I don't need any ordering, but since it's dependent on a parameter, it's not going to show the values yet, but this is like a simple example view of it. I'm not going to choose any of them, but if I were to use this list to choose something, to select something, I should like choose the primary key at this part. And next to it, let's say student info. This is the label that it puts automatically there. And I know that this is going to be not much thing, so I can like resize this, etc. And inside the student form, whenever I refresh it in the form view, if the last login was from a student, this is not the case for now, but it will display the information for that student. Going back to the login form, I will go into the layout view and for the login button. So in this area, I will find the position that I decided that this is a student. So at this position, I'm saying this is a student, and then I would like to navigate into the student form. So we had the open form action for that. I can choose the name of that form. So the student form. This is a student. I should go into the student form, and I can also close this login form. So this was the list of things that we are using. We also have close window. It can close any of the forms or other things, etc. So for this new action, I'm going to say close window. I need to define the object type because it can close other things as well, like tables, queries, etc. I would like to close a form, and it is going to be this form. So remember, I'm inside the macro of the button inside the login form. I can close the same form. So I'm going to say, okay, after this, we already know that we opened the student form. We can close the login form at this position. So I'm going to save it and close it. And I'm going to save and close the new forms as well. So we added some new parts, etc. Going back to the login form, so this will be like also closed. Whenever you are showing the demo of your project, you are going to first open up the login page, for example. So this is my login form, and starting from here, I should be able to navigate in all of the other forms. I need the student information. I guess Rick was a student, L28 was the password. I'm trying to log in, but I cannot, so 2L8, I guess. Okay, 2L8. So user ID is found. This is a student. If I click on OK, it navigates into the student form. It using this, not automatically, we like wrote the macro for it. Using the close window action, it closed the login form as well. Now I'm inside the student form, and for this UID, it found the student information. I can also see the payment for the student. And similarly, I can do it for every different kind of user. And going into the layout view, if I'm inside this student form, I should be able to somehow log out. So I'm going to add a button to do that. I'm going to cancel the wizard. Let's write log out here. So logging out is like going into the build events. I'm going to use the macro builder. The simplest thing is you can go into the login page again. So I'm using the open form action. Let's say go into the login form and close window. I know that we are inside the student form. Close window of the object type is a form, and the name of the form is the student form. These two are like enough, but like if you would like to set some of the temporary variables to null values, you can also do that. So to be, let's say, more safe, you can say set temp var. So in this part, I know that I'm using the UID of the student. I can set it to some like not meaningful value, like -1. So if the user is able to open the student form somehow, the user ID would be like going out, it would be -1. but like we don't expect you to like do such things, and like this is not really a security thing. It's not that good, but so like when you are logging out, such things could be done. So I'm going to save this macro, going to close it, and whenever I'm here I can click on the logout button. It will return me back into this position, but since I changed something in the student form, I haven't saved it. While it's trying to close it, it's asking me whether I would like to save it or not. And if I were to like double click on the student form to open it again, I don't see Rick here because I set UID to -1. If I weren't, then whenever I double click on the student form, it would show the Rick still, because UID would still be the Rick's ID. So I can also go into the other types of users to create their pages, but like it's straightforward. So maybe a more interesting thing could be to list the courses of that student. So list courses that are available for students. It was some query that we did, but given a student ID, I have the list courses of student query. So if I give the student ID, it is listing the courses of this student. If I go into the design view of this query, the student ID is a parameter. So instead of using the parameter, I can use the UID, the user's ID from temporary variables. So for this UID, I can list the courses of the student. So I modified this query. I will save it, list courses of student. I'm going to close it. Inside the student form, I can go into the layout view, add another list box, and this time again I'm getting the results out of a query. First option is selected for the query. The query name is going to be list courses of students. So list courses of student query. And I would like to show everything. And I don't want to return anything, but like one of them should be selected. Let's go with the primary key again. We can say courses, and it is going to list the courses of this student. Which student logins, it is going to show the courses of that student. Let's add one more thing. It's not really a meaningful thing in this case, but let's say I would like to, using a query, send some part of my scholarship amount to some other student. So in some of your scenarios, you may need such things. So think it like a bank operation, and think like the scholarships are kind of like credits for the students. And let's say I would like to be able to, in my account only, send some part of my scholarship to some other student. So I'm going to include a text box to enter the amount to send. I'm going to add a button. So we can say send scholarship here. And in this text box, let's look at the name in the properties. So let's call it scholarship something. Let's call it SC. So I need some queries. So I need one query to decrease the amount from this student. I need some other student to send my scholarship to. The ID of that student is required. So I can include some other combo box here to list the available students, or it could be a text box to enter the ID of that student. So let's use the combo box for that. But I need to be able to list the students. So if you remember, we already have such query. So I can list the students with their IDs using the list students query. So in my student form, going into the layout view, under this design tab, I'm going to add a combo box. And in that combo box, I would like to get the results from a query. And that query is going to be the list students query. I would like to show everything. I'm clicking on next. This is the example view of it. It is displaying all the available students. Whenever I choose one row here, I would like to get the student ID, not the username, not the surname. I need to get the primary key. it should be the student ID. Clicking on next. Let's say student to transfer to, something like that. I'm going to hit on finish. So this information we got here is going to be the student that I would like to send the scholarship, and this is going to be my amount. The student's ID would come from this combo box. Let's call it ST to student transfer. So we have SC and ST. Maybe I should note them somewhere, because we are going to get these results out of our in our queries. So right now, when I click on this button, I would like to run a query that decreases my scholarship amount and increases the scholarship amount of such students. So to do that, I need to update the student table. I need another query. Going to create and query design. I will this time use the SQL code directly. I can write here, update the student table. I would like to set the value. So if you look at into the student table, there is this scholarship attribute. So in my query, I'm going to set this scholarship amount to be equal to scholarship minus from the forms. I'm inside the student form. And remember, the thing that we write the amount, it was called SC for scholarship. So there is some written value there. Decrease it from me, I'm going to say in here. So I'm going to have a var condition saying that the student underscore ID, it should be equal to the one that's inside temp vars exclamation mark UID. So I know that in this position I have the ID of the student that I log in as. So it is going to function only for the student that I log in as, and it's going to decrease the scholarship amount from me. So it's going to decrease this amount. I'm going to save it as decrease scholarship. I'm going to copy this and create a new query. It's going to be like a similar query, but this time in the student table, I would like to increase the scholarship amount by this value. And this time it's not for the student that I log in as, it's going to be for the student's ID that I include in ST, the student that I transfer to. So I'm going to get that ID. For this student, I'm going to increase the scholarship amount. So I'm saving it as increase SC this time. So these should be run like next to them. So first I'm going to decrease my amount and then increase the other student's amount. Going back to the student form, if I go into the layout view, whenever I click on this send scholarship button, I would like to transfer my amount. So going into the macro builder for this button, I'm going to open query. So if that query is not open as a tab, and if it's an update query, it's going to just directly run it. Decrease scholarship amount, I'm going to run this, and I would like to also open another query. This time it's to increase the scholarship amount of some other person. And remember, we were showing the student information in this list box. If I check, its name is list 0. Let's call it info. I would like to also update this info because it is showing my scholarship amount and I want it to be updated as well. So going back into this send scholarship macro, I can requery my item, and that item is called info. So I will save this, close other tabs, and starting from the login form. If I log in as Rick, user ID, this is a student, I see my scholarship amount. These are my courses. Choosing another student, let's choose one of them, number 13. I can send some amount. You might include some additional checks here. So the maximum amount I can send is 45. I should like find the value of my maximum. I should not be able to write something bigger than that, etc. Let's write 30 for this now. Let's click on send scholarship. It's going to decrease my amount for the first query, and for the second query it's going to increase the other person's amount, and it's also updated my amount here. And if I log out, or for 13, let's check the information, James. So I'm logging out and I will log in as James. I see this is my amount, so I can send some to Rick as well. Let's send 100. So those double queries, my amount is updated. If I go back into Rick, I should see that his amount is up by 100. So the problems in this part, maybe I'm not writing anything, then that query would fail, right? Nothing to be updated. But since I set the value based on my amount plus this value, this is null, I should not let the queries to run. So if this amount is null, so if I go into the layout view, going into the macro of this button, I would like to run these if, putting my if action here, if SC is not null, so SC should be not null for me to continue. SC was the amount part. Message box, if it's null, I can say that enter amount. I can also check whether SC is larger than something, etc. I'm not going to do it, but like in your case you might do such things. I can add an else if part. I can also check with is null function. With is null function I can also check the ST. So this is the student. In the message box I can say select a student. Continuing from this else if I add another else part, then I can successfully do the job. I can first decrease and then increase and then requery. So these are my checks at first with the message, corresponding messages, and if both of them are not null, then I can continue running these functions, updating my query. I can also like display some other message box saying that okay, this is going to be an expression, starts with the equal sign, successfully sent ampersand sign, the amount is in SC. I can write SC here to student ID, these are in string, followed by the ST. So this is the ID of that student. So I'm going to save it, close it, and I need to fix Rick's scholarship amount, since if it's null, it's not going to work. So I updated the values of the students. I'm going to save this form, going back to my login form. I can log in as one of the students. This is my home page. If I don't write any amount, it says enter some amount. I can add any additional checks for amount to be less than something, higher than something, etc. Now if I try to send, it says select a student. Then if I choose one of the students, it is running these two update queries and it displays my message be sent to student number 13, etc. So any questions, problems? I'm going to upload this finished version as well as we have the recordings, and this is the, let's say, last tutorial lab, and in the upcoming weeks we have these implementation stages and the final demo. And for one of them we are using the lab time for implementation stage 2. The details are included in this document, but for this implementation stage 2 we are going to use the lab time. But during the lab time you are going to meet with your TA. So we are going to arrange some time slots for each of the groups, and you should like come to the meeting as a group. All members should be there. Otherwise, the things that we need to be able to do the project are done. Again, if you have like any problems, etc., you can like contact us individually. But the things that we discussed should be enough for you to implement any of these scenarios for each of your projects. For example, login as a doctor, list all disease types. So it means that you are going to use a list box if you are listing something. Choose one disease type. So if you are choosing, the combo box item is the way to go to list existing diseases of that type. So I'm choosing something, then I might update some list box. Create a patient record. So if I'm creating something, I need text boxes and a button to like run my update query as well. So we have we would have our labs as like videos as well. If you need to like refer back to them, you can use them as well. Any questions, problems? Otherwise we are going to end the meeting. So if you don't have any questions, then I'm going to end the meeting. See you later during your demos then. Sağ ol Süleyman, görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz. Şey yapalım
Görüşürüz.
ama.
Hayır yok, sorun değil. Yani hani bir şey yok
Görüşürüz
zaten.
hocam.
Görüşürüz. İyi günler. Okay, see you all later.